I started this garden just 6 months ago, and you know, it hasn't seen an ounce of artificial fertiliser nor a drop of chemical pesticide at all. Yet it produces for me an abundance of flowers, fruit and vegetables, and believe me, it's given me a lot of enjoyment too. So I don't have to tell you that organic gardening works, just take a look around. And there's nothing whatever cranky about it either. What the organic gardener does is to grow in just the same way that nature has been doing, well, forever, only perhaps just a little more so. The chemical gardener, on the other hand, spends a lot of money killing wildlife, endangering his own health and that of his family. So who's the cranky one? Well, of course, organic gardening is an enormous subject. So what we've tried to do here is to introduce you to the basic techniques that'll get you going. We've crammed a lot in, and we've tried not to waste any time. So the few lists, for example, that there are only on the screen for a few seconds. So if you want to read and inwardly digest those, then you'll have to use your pause button. What's more, I don't believe that it's possible to give a hard and fast blueprint for organic gardening. A lot of it comes from experience, and there's a fair bit of seat of the pants stuff too. But what I can guarantee is this, that it's a lot easier to grow this way, it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot safer, and because you share the garden with all the wildlife that's around, it's a lot more enjoyable too. And what the organic gardener has got to get to grips with first is this stuff. Soil is not a lifeless, inert mass of little bits of weathered rock. Far from it. If you've got a really good, rich soil, a cubic metre of it will be home for an unbelievable 1,000 million organisms. And there's an incredible mixture of them too. Bacteria, fungi, tiny worms, grubs, mites and beetles. Some have 9 pairs of legs and some a lot more. Of course there are centipedes, millipedes, lice, slugs, snails, earthworms and hundreds of different organisms, all involved in breaking down dead plant material, roots and very often each other to produce in the end that vital soil ingredient, humus. So to get a good soil, the trick is to provide a lot of dead plant material and to create the best possible conditions for all these organisms, from the smallest to the largest, to get to work. In nature it's a slow process because when they're just lying on the surface, fresh leaves and stalks are not very attractive food to soil organisms until they've been weathered. Then fungi and bacteria start breaking them down, and after that the mites and the millipedes, the lice and the worms get to work. In the compost heap, where they've got the right moisture and temperature, they work fast. Earthworms and insects break down the bigger bits and smaller organisms take it up from there. And as a result, organic chemicals are released in a state in which a living plant can absorb them through its roots. The acidity of the soil matters in 2 ways. Firstly, if it's very acid, or the reverse, very alkaline, those vital chemicals can react and become unavailable to growing plants. Secondly, the most important organisms don't like extremes of acidity or alkalinity. So it doesn't matter which mineral soil you start with, sandy, chalky or heavy clay, the principles are just the same. Plenty of organic matter, the sort of conditions that soil organisms thrive in, and hey presto, they'll make humus. The exact composition of humus is unknown, but it contains most of the vital ingredients for plant nutrition: nitrogen, phosphates, potash, and 100 others. It also plays a vital part in soil structure, forming crumbs that hold moisture and let air into the soil and at the same time improve drainage. I got this bit of soil out of the farmer's field, which is no more than 50 yards away from here. It's grown corn for donkey's years, and it's never had any organic matter put into it at all. And it is hard as a rock. In fact, I can only just break it apart. Now, there's very little air going to get through that, certainly no water. And most important, it's dead as a doornail. Now look at my soil, which is teeming with life. And that's because I've been digging organic matter into this over the last 5 years. And I've had plenty of alternatives to choose from. This is farmyard manure. It doesn't matter whether it comes from a pig or a cow or a sheep, whatever you can get your hands on, then get it, because this is pure gold dust. It contains lots of nutrients and it's a very good soil conditioner indeed, and will provide a home for millions of bacteria. You must make sure that it's well rotted like this. It needs to be rotted for at least a year, and that's wonderful. The great snag with it, of course, is that it is extremely hard to get hold of these days, and I think getting even harder. This is a lot easier to get hold of. This is horse manure, and you very often see bags of this for sale on the roadside these days. And this again is excellent stuff. Get as much of it as you can afford. But this stuff is not rotted. This is fresh horse manure, and it's very strong. It's likely to cause scorching on plant roots, and particularly seedlings. So you must compost that for at least 6 months. I compost mine with grass cuttings, and it makes a very good soil conditioner indeed. This one is second only, I think, to farmyard manure. This is garden compost. I made this myself out of all the weeds and grass cuttings, etc. that I've got. It really is a superb soil conditioner, plenty of nutrients in it, and of course it's the cheapest you can possibly have. Every organic gardener must have a compost heap. This one you see quite a lot of now. This is spent mushroom compost, and it's a super soil conditioner. It consists of well-rotted horse manure plus a little bit of peat. But it does have one limitation. If you look at it, you can see here that there's plenty of free lime in it. The mushroom growers use that, growing the mushrooms, and therefore that means that it's going to raise the pH of the soil. Probably not a good thing to use in the ornamental borders, but ideal for the vegetable garden and quite cheap. Well, they're the cheaper forms of organic matter. Many of them are a bit hard to come by, but these days, if you go down to the garden centre, there are plenty that you can find. And this is one of the best of the lot, in my opinion. This one is composted farmyard manure. It's exactly the same as the first one we looked at, except that this has been composted for a couple of years. It means that it's very concentrated stuff. So although it's quite expensive, you don't need nearly as much of this as you do of farmyard manure. And of course, peat has been around for a long time. This is sphagnum peat. It's nice, brown-looking stuff. And this is an excellent soil conditioner. It'll hold many times its own weight of water and provide a home again for millions of soil organisms. It has two snags. One is the fact that it doesn't contain any plant nutrients at all, so you've got to put those on extra in some form or another. And the other, of course, is that it's mighty expensive. This is another form of peat. This one is sedge peat, much blacker than the other one. And because it's that colour, many gardeners feel that this must be a better medium than the brown stuff. Well, in actual fact, just the reverse is true. This is quite a bit older, and that means it's less stable. When it gets wet, it can go into a solid ball, and that's not a good thing. Frankly, I wouldn't give that one garden room. Under most garden situations, normally it's only necessary to single dig the soil, and that means taking out a trench like this just to one depth of the spade and throwing the soil forwards to make a nice straight little trench like that. And that's where you put your organic matter. It's in the bottom of the trench like this. As far as amounts are concerned, that is plenty actually of this stuff, but if the budget will stand it, quite honestly, the more the merrier. And then you just simply dig the next trench, covering up that bit of organic matter, and I will actually later on put a little bit over the top of the soil as well. There are some situations where it's worthwhile taking a little bit more effort and digging a bit deeper. If you've got a brand new garden, for example, it's well worth digging deeply. And I would, on my vegetable garden where the soil is heavy, double dig at least once every 5 years, say, something like that. It is a bit more effort, but it's well worth doing. What I've done here is to take out a trench about 2 feet, 60 centimetres wide, and I've carted that soil from there up to the other end of the plot, and that will be there ready, waiting for me when I've dug the last trench to fill that in. Now, when you've dug down to 1 spade deep, what you do then is to break up the bottom. Now, this, bear in mind, is subsoil, so you don't want to bring it up to the surface. Just get your fork in there and break it up like that, and that will improve the drainage. It'll increase the root zone as well, and eventually give you quite a deep topsoil. That's ideal. Now, when you've done that, again, organic matter's the order of the day. So you get a fair layer of organic matter in the bottom there. Once again, this sort of amount of this stuff is plenty. The more the merrier. Right, now, when you've got your organic matter in there, you want to cover that up with the next trench full of soil. But it's important to make the next trench exactly the same size as that one, because that way you'll dig the area level. I make mine, as I say, 2 foot, 60 centimetres wide, and I cut a couple of canes like that, just to make sure I know exactly what I'm doing. And then you simply throw the soil forward to cover up that bit of organic matter. But it's important not to just put the organic matter in the bottom of the trench, as I must say is sometimes advised. You want it through all the levels of the soil right the way through. So once you've half filled the trench, get another layer of organic matter on it. Like that, to make a really rich and fertile soil. And then cover that up. And I would even, when I've finished, put a little bit more right on the top as well. That's super. You grow some really good plants in that. Now, if you want to grow vegetables, and what organic gardener doesn't, and you want to make the very best use of every single square inch of land, then you utilise this double digging technique, but you do it in beds which are 4 foot wide, about 1.25 metres, like this, so that they're nice and raised, full of organic matter, and that will grow some really good vegetables. As I said at the beginning, don't forget the essence of this job really is to keep adding the organic matter. Now, you can improve the soil greatly just by growing things on it. So one of the organic gardener's methods is to use green manure. That means just growing a crop in order to dig it in and add organic matter. Difficulty, the snag with it, is the fact that it obviously takes up space. So you won't want to be doing a lot of it during the spring or the summer when you'll want to use the land for fruit, vegetables or flowers. But you know, we often have a little bit of ground like this bit, which is going to be spare, not used for probably anything between 3 and 6 weeks. And you can sow on that something like mustard. It's absolutely ideal because it grows at a tremendous rate, and within certainly 6 weeks it will be ready for digging in. All you've got to do is to thinly broadcast it over the ground like this, and then just rake it in. Now, the snag with that, of course, is that I've been spending a lot of time trying to attract my friends the birds into the garden as predators. They'll eat caterpillars and things, and they'll also eat mustard seed, of course. So if you've got that sort of problem with birds, and I hope you have, it's a good problem to have, then it's best to cover the seed, and you do that just by making drills, shallow drills, round about 6 to 9 inches apart. It isn't important to get it absolutely accurate, and it isn't important to get the lines absolutely straight either. Nice way of gardening this. And then just sow the seed down the drills, again fairly thinly. And when you've sown them all, then you just run the rake over the top like that. Well, 5 weeks on and it's ready for digging in. In fact, I've only just caught this because it's important to dig it in before it starts to flower. And you can see it's just beginning. This is because after flowering, the stems tend to get a little bit too woody and it'll take a long time for them to rot down. And of course, if you leave it even longer than that, then you're digging in seed, and of course then you get another crop of green manure, which is not what you want. It's also important to wilt it because it'll rot down a lot better, a lot quicker when it's in a wilted state. And the way you do that is simply to chop it off with a spade like this, and then you would leave it for, a few hours, I suppose, until it's lying there nice and wilted. There we are, it's not a difficult job. The stuff in the front here, I cut off a while ago, and that's already wilted, and so therefore in a good condition to dig it in. And the way you do that is normal single digging method I would use, generally just to make a little trench like that. And you might find you've got to chop this up a bit, but work a little bit in the bottom and then cover that over with the soil from the next trench. And the bacteria, of course, are going to work on that and rot that down. The very first principle of good organic gardening, of course, is to get to know your soil. Now, while I don't think it's necessary for organic gardeners to know the level of all the nutrients in the soil, it is important to know the pH. That is how acid or how limey the soil is, because this will affect all plant growth. What's more, these days it's very easy and quite good fun to test it, so don't fail to do it. You take your soil sample using a clean spoon. Don't even touch it with your fingers, because even the acidity of your hands can alter the soil sample, and get down to something like, 8 or 10 centimetres, and take a sample from down there. You don't need a great deal. Now that sample needs to be dried, but you don't want to put it onto the stove or anything like that, because that again could alter it. Just air dry it. That might take quite some time. Well, here's a sample that has been dried, and when it has been, you could just crush it up a little, remove any stones or anything like that, bits of grass that you might find in it, and then you can start testing it. Now, I've really refined these test kits these days, and I reckon that they're pretty good and certainly very easy to use. The first thing is a little syringe, and what you do is you take the plunger out and put a little filter paper in it. They supply these little filter papers now, so you can push out a disc with this little plastic plunger, come out, and put the disc inside the syringe like that, and then just push it down with the plastic plunger so that it's flat on the bottom. There we are, even I can do that. Right, now a little bit of soil in there, and you need to come up to that first mark on the syringe with the soil, so it isn't a great deal. Do it like this, you get a nice fine sample of soil. That's about right. And then also in the kit is a little tube there of solution, and you pour that in up to the top mark. That's about right. Now, put the plunger back in and then just shake it up for about 30 seconds. It really is well worthwhile making a proper job of this, 30 seconds, because believe me, the information that you get on how limey your soil is absolutely vital. Right, after 30 seconds of vigorous shaking, you can then turn the syringe upside down and take this little cap off. Make sure that doesn't blow away, because I might want to take another test. And then you force the solution through into the test tube, through the filter paper. And you'll notice that that's coming out coloured. And that colour is what tells you how acid or alkaline your soil is. You put the lid back on there. And now just compare that with a colour chart. Now you can see that says there pH 4.5, and that's round about the same colour. I'd say it's between 5 and 4.5. Now pH 7, which is this green colour, that's neutral. Anything below that is acid, so you can see that in fact this is quite an acid soil that I've got there, and that really is good to know, because what I want to do on this bed is to grow some cabbages. Now you know that cabbages are lime lovers, so I'm going to need to put a fair bit of lime on here. Now, you could use ordinary lime, but I'm going to go one better and use calcified seaweed. Now you put a fair bit of this stuff on. The best time really to put this on is in the autumn, because in actual fact it does take a little while for it to affect the soil, but once it does get in the soil, it's fairly slow release, so it'll last quite a long time. That should do me. Now I want to add also some of the major nutrients as well, so I should be putting on just a little sprinkling of bloodfish and bone meal. Don't need a great deal. And then that can be raked into the soil. Ideally, if you can do this just a week or two before planting, then it'll be in solution ready for the plants to take up immediately. That's fine. I use a planting board on these deep beds. That's the absolute ideal way of planting, because you've got your line and your distance apart. And note that these cabbages I've dug out carefully. Some people pull them out for some reason. I think it's silly to grow a good root system and then destroy it like that, so I quite carefully divide these, just like that. Let's just get those out of the way. Then they want to go in about 18 inches apart and fairly deep. You want to put them so that the bottom leaves come about level with the soil surface like that. I won't do them all, I'll finish that row off a little bit later on. They want watering in afterwards, and really puddle them in, give them a good old drink like that. There we go. Now of course, during the summer, cabbages, any member of the cabbage family, is at risk from cabbage root fly. They're real killers. They get in there and the little maggots will eat all the roots away. The organic gardener can solve that problem completely, just with a little bit of foam rubber carpet underlay like that. You can beg that from the carpet fitter, cut a slit in it and make sure that it fits absolutely exactly round the stem, and you'll find then that the female fly can't get her egg tube down right close up against the cabbage, and if she can't do that, then she'll fly off and lay her eggs on somebody else's cabbage. If you can't be bothered with the foam rubber, then you can buy these little tarred discs, which will fit round and do just as good a job. Well, that's easy, really, cabbage root fly, but what do you do about clubroot? Now, there's a real difficult one. Well, the very first thing you do is to lime much more regularly than this. I mean, really keep the lime level high, because clubroot hates lime. So that will help a bit. And the other way is to grow your cabbages first of all in pots and build up a really good root system. Now when you plant those out, the cabbage will still actually get club root, but because it's got a good root system to start with, it will be able to recover. Now I put these in these pots only a week ago, and you can't actually see a lot of root on that one. Let's have a look at another one. But yes, you can see there that it's going away quite nicely. So I'll leave those in there for another couple of weeks so they've got a really good root system, and then plant them out. But when you do pot them up, of course, do make sure that you put them into an organic compost which you know is free from club root. Seaweed is one of those weapons in the organic gardener's armoury that, amongst other things, enables him to correct mistakes. And let's face it, we all make mistakes. I've got some plants here that I started off in the greenhouse, and because the weather turned very wet, I wasn't able to get them out in time. And the result of that is that the leaves have gone yellow, the plants have hardened up, and when I put them out in the garden, it'll be the devil's own job to get them growing again. Now what they need is a boost, and seaweed is the ideal thing to do it with. But when you do, don't just water it on. It's much better to put your seaweed into a sprayer and actually spray it on the leaves. And the reason is that the leaves will take up small amounts of nutrients far, far quicker than the roots will, even underneath. So give them a really good spraying over, and that's a real tonic. Now mind you, although it's quick acting, it also doesn't last very long. So I'm going to do a real belt and braces job here, and I'm also going to water some on the roots. And that means that once they've exhausted those nutrients that I've sprayed on the leaves, they'll have had time to take some up from the roots as well. And do bear in mind that this border has been already treated with bloodfish and bone meal, which is a slow release fertiliser, so they're going to have a supply of nutrients right the way through the year, and I'm confident of getting some really good crops. Research has shown that seaweed extract is a splendid aid to plant growth. It makes some seeds germinate faster, roots develop better, many vegetables grow bigger, and trees set more fruit. Seaweed is a tonic to an ailing plant and can reduce mildew in melons, botrytis in strawberries. It can suppress flea beetles, spider mites and aphids, and even increases frost resistance in tomatoes. It really is the plant's best friend. Seaweed extract contains nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium and sulphur, though not in large enough quantities to maintain plant growth. Its really important constituents are the trace elements: copper, iron, manganese, zinc, boron, molybdenum, cobalt and many others. They're all essential inputs for that biochemical factory, the growing plant. Seaweed extract also contains hormones that act as growth regulators and a substance which is thought to release nutrients already in the soil. So seaweed is a little bit of magic for plants. Of course, it doesn't solve every gardening problem, but any organic gardener would be missing out badly if he didn't use it as an aid to healthy plant growth. However, there are two very important things to remember. First, that it should be used exactly as recommended, so read the label carefully. And, most important, seaweed can't provide on its own all the nutrients that your plant needs. The great thing about the deep bed method of growing vegetables is that it enables the organic gardener to concentrate all his resources into a small space and still get as much of a crop as you would from double the space by conventional methods. Now, normally you would use plenty of farmyard manure perhaps, and if you do that then you probably won't need any fertiliser at all. But most of us can't get farmyard manure these days, so it's a good idea to use something out of the bag, and that means an organic fertiliser, and this is blood, fish and bone meal I'm using here. You don't need, with organic fertilisers, to be quite as deadly accurate as you do with the inorganic ones, and do bear in mind too that they're slow release, that they won't release their nutrients very quickly but over a long period. So instead of just fertilising part of the bed for a particular crop, you can do the whole lot all at once, and then you just rake that into the top. If you possibly can do this about a fortnight before you sow, and then you know that the fertiliser is going to be there waiting for the plants when you actually come to sow. That's absolutely ideal. Now, as I say, if you're using farmyard manure, then you're going to have really all the plant food that you need. If not, there's a possibility that you might have a shortage of trace elements. So what I do is to use calcified seaweed, which is this stuff, and I put this on actually in the autumn, and that is very long lasting, and it'll provide all the trace elements that you require. The alternative way of doing it is to actually treat the crops as they're growing with a liquid seaweed feed, which you just dilute in water, and then you can simply just water it over your crops, and that will provide all the trace elements that's necessary. My goodness, it even looks fertile, this stuff. Lovely. When it comes to sowing, the thing that I like about this is that it's very encouraging, because you sow in short rows, and when it comes to the weeding, you know what it's like when you look at a long, long row. This way, you've only got short ones to do. Now, I use a planting board like this. I find this is absolutely ideal. I stick a couple of canes in just to make sure that I get a straight line. If you're sowing small seeds, you want very shallow drills. And the way to get those is very, very easy. Just tip your planting board on its edge, work it backwards and forwards like that, and you've got a perfect shallow drill. It couldn't be easier, could it? Things like lettuce. Now, before we do this, it's dry weather. So what I'm going to do is to make sure that we've got enough moisture in that drill before we sow. You don't want to put water on afterwards if you can help it, because that tends to cap the soil and the seedlings can't get through. I'm using this seaweed, so there's an extra little bit of nutrient there. Oh, you can use ordinary water if you want to. Right, now I can sow. And the way that I do it is a little pinch in my hand like this. Some people can do it out of the packet straight away. I suppose I'm a bit clumsy. I never seem to be able to get them thin enough that way. But this way, absolutely easy. Always sow them thinly. That will give me enough lettuce there to feed the whole village, I think. And then you can just cover these rows over with your hand. A little bit of dry soil over the top, not wet, and then just tap them down with the back of your hand, and there you are. And most important of all, that's the one, don't forget the label. Now, there are some things that are better off sown in a broad band rather than in a row. Things like spring onions or radishes, you don't really need to thin at all. So you can just take a broad band like this, again fairly shallow, just the width of the hoe, it's ideal. And so, again fairly thinly in there, just sort of broadcasters in the row like that. And again, there'll be enough radishes there, certainly to last me for some considerable time, and bet your life I'll be giving a load away as well. And then those I would just cover up, I think, with the rake like that. And just tap them down. Some seeds I raised in the greenhouse, and the leeks, for example, were raised multiple sown in these polystyrene packs like this. Ideal method of raising leeks. And they're planted out, not so much in rows, but really in blocks. Again, I use my good old planting board, and you'll notice that I'm planting in between the two plants in the last row, so that will form a complete block. And then you see the next row goes in like that, in between the two from the last one, you see. So you've got a complete block there, and that really does save a lot of space. And one of the most encouraging things, I think, about deep bed growing is that the cultivations are really so easy. You'll notice here that these beetroot, for example, they're going to very quickly leaf up and completely cover the ground and blank out all the weeds. There'll be nothing to come through there. There are one or two small weeds now, and that's the time to catch them. And of course, organic gardens never use chemical herbicides. This is the best herbicide you could possibly get, the hoe, and you can just go down a row like that. It really is as simple as that. And just weed through those. I don't think you have to do that again for the rest of the season at all. Now, if you're growing in the traditional way, not with deep beds, then this, I think, is the very best hoe to use. This is the Dutch hoe, and of course you use this one walking backwards so that you don't tread the weeds in again into the ground after you've done them. Now, I do have quite a bird problem down here, and I've actually left these just to illustrate what sort of damage they can do. These are pigeons, but for heaven's sake, I don't want to discourage them from my garden because they do a great deal of good as well, but they're ever so easy to just keep off your crops, because all you've got to do is to put down a little bit of bird netting like that, and provided you anchor it very well at the edges, there's no chance of those birds getting caught up. Every organic gardener must have a compost heap. It's a very convenient way of getting rid of all your garden rubbish, and it will also make for you a soil conditioner which is second only to farmyard manure, and it's more or less free. Now, in order to make it, the best thing is to have a compost container. This one I made myself from some second-hand timber that I bought from the demolition contractor very cheaply. It's made with floorboards and floor joists, and it's just really a square box with these slats in the front that will give you access to the compost. Very easy to make and very cheap. In order to keep the heat in and the wet out, which is quite important, I've just used a bit of old carpet like this. You'll just go over the top and that will do the job perfectly. Alternatively, if you want something a bit neater, you can go to the garden centre and buy something like this plastic one. It's a very good compost container and it's not expensive. Note with both of these that there aren't any air holes in the side. Plenty of air will get up through the bottom, and it's far more important to keep the heat in to get that compost rotted down really fast. This is one that I made myself out of a barrel from a factory. It's just an old plastic barrel that they gave me. They were pleased to get rid of it. I just cut the top and the bottom off, and that makes a perfectly good container for nothing. Now, what can you put on a compost heap? Well, the answer really is virtually anything that will rot down. Of course, you use all your old weeds that you pull out of the garden. That's absolutely essential and a darn good way of getting rid of them. Any uncooked kitchen scraps can go on as well. Don't use cooked ones because they do tend to attract rats. Grass cuttings are absolutely ideal on the compost heap, and of course there are quite a lot of those, and since you won't be using any weed killers, then they're not going to cause any problems at all. The things not to put on are plants that are diseased at all, because you don't want to spread disease, weeds that have reached this stage where they're actually seeding, because then you'll spread seeds throughout your compost and eventually onto your garden, not a good thing. And any of those pernicious perennial weeds where the roots won't rot down, things like couch grass, ground elder, docks, anything like that. Now, to make it, what you need is plenty of air in the heap. The bacteria that rot it down really do require air, so it's important to mix up the materials that you put in. I start out by using a layer of horse manure. This is very strawy horse manure. You can generally buy this, of course, at the roadside, but if you can't get any, then straw would do. And if you don't want to use that, then use some of your coarser weeds or vegetable waste. This is actually old pea haulm, and that is absolutely ideal for providing a nice airy layer. Then on top of that, you can put something that will pack down a bit closer, like grass cuttings. These are super, but they do have the disadvantage that they pack down and form an airless mass, and then it goes slimy, and that's useless. So make sure that you mix it well in with this airy stuff, and you get plenty of air through the compost heap like that. And then when you've done that, perhaps a layer of weeds or kitchen waste after that, and just keep building it up. If you're using horse muck in there, of course you won't need an activator at all. But if not, I think it's a good idea to put a little bit of calcified seaweed on. I suppose at about every foot layer. You don't need a lot. That would do admirably. Right, then you keep building that up. Don't forget always to put the piece of old carpet over the top. And when it reaches the top, it's a jolly good idea to aerate it once again by turning it. And all I do is simply dig it all out until the whole thing is empty and chuck it all back in again. And if you shake it up like that, you'll find that it will aerate extremely well. If you do it like that, in the summer, you'll get really good compost in a matter of months. In the winter, of course, the bugs all tend to go to sleep, so it takes quite a bit longer. But even then, in the spring, you'll open up your compost heap and you'll dig out stuff like this. And that is a perfect soil conditioner. But you know, you can greatly improve your compost by, first of all, putting the organic matter through a worm. It's funny, but worms actually improve it tremendously. When it goes into the worm, it's ordinary green organic matter. When it comes out, they've pelletized it, first of all, by coating each little pellet with a gel, which makes it an absolutely perfect consistency for growing in. It also retains all its trace elements and major nutrients as well. And it's also thought that they coat it with growth promoting substances too. So, in other words, what comes out of the back of a worm is a perfect growing medium. Now, you can get worms to work for you quite easily. All you need is a couple of plastic buckets like this. Do drill some holes in the bottom, because when the worms work the organic matter, they tend to make quite a lot of liquid, and that needs to drain away. And for the same reason, just put it on a couple of bricks like that so that it will freely drain. Now, what you do is this. Start them off, first of all, with a little starter material just to make them feel at home. This is stuff that I've taken out of the compost heap. It's fairly well rotted compost, they like that. Alternatively, you can use peat with a little bit of seaweed meal mixed in it, so that will be okay. And then you put your worms in. Now, these are no ordinary worms. They're not ordinary earthworms that you'll find in the garden. These are called brandlings, and you can see that they're much redder and smaller. Now, you'll find any number of those in any muck heap. So if you've got a friendly farmer around, you can probably collect a few there. If not, they're the sort of worms that are used by anglers for bait, so you can buy them from the fishing tackle shop. And a much better use for them, this is too. So just put them in there, into that lot, and then you can start adding ordinary material that you would put on the compost heap. Weeds, kitchen waste, grass cuttings, but not too many. You don't want to actually cover them with grass cuttings because that's a bit acid and slimy, but weeds are absolutely ideal. What will happen is that they will work their way through that stuff, gradually working from the bottom to the top. Now, they'll only work at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, so make sure that they're in a reasonably warm spot, but never let that dry out because they must have some moisture. In the winter, they'll be killed by frost, remember that, so you must protect them from frost by perhaps bringing the bucket into the greenhouse or wrapping it round. Now, when they've worked their way right the way through to the top, you've got this lovely stuff. But bear in mind, of course, that it's full of worms. So what you've got to do is to sieve it out. This really is beautiful stuff. Now, you'll find when you've sieved it, of course, that you'll get a certain amount of unworked organic matter and a certain number of worms in there as well. So you don't waste that lot. What you do, of course, is you put it back in your first bucket. Those worms will keep on multiplying like that, and you'll get some really good stuff. Now, this stuff, of course, is much too valuable just to be dug into the ground. So what I would use it for would be seed sowing compost. Just look at that. Seed sowing composts, potting composts, or it's a good idea too, if your soil is a little bit heavy, to make a slightly deeper drill when you're sowing outside and put a little bit of this in, and believe me, your seedlings will get away like mad. There are some times of the year, particularly towards the end of the season, when there's just too much vegetation to ever fit into the compost heap. But fortunately, at that time of the year, there's also a fair amount of spare ground available too. So instead of wasting all this valuable organic material, the best bet is to just spread it out on the surface of the ground, and then once it's really started to rot down, then you can dig it in. This is much better than digging it in green straight away, because if you do that, the bacteria that rot it down will actually rob the soil of nitrogen as their fuel to do the rotting process. But this way, you can dig it in later and there'll be no nitrogen loss at all. Just look at that. This stuff is absolutely crawling with life. And these are just the big ones you can see. For every one of those, you can guarantee that there are 1 million microorganisms, and they're all breaking down this organic matter. This is stuff that I made some time ago. It's my own homemade mulch, and already this is alive. This is how I made it. I used a machine like this. This is a shredder. It isn't cheap, so it's the sort of tool either for a big garden, or if you can all clump together, perhaps all the gardeners in the road, and get one of these, because you'll find it's absolutely invaluable. It can turn all your prunings into useful mulch like this. And this is what I do. All you've got to do is to stick these through this machine. It isn't dangerous because you can't put your hand in there. It's so made that you can't get your hand down to the work, so there's no danger in it at all. It sounds a bit dangerous, it's a bit of a noisy job, but this is the way it works. I've been putting my homemade mulch on the conifer bed here for the last 4.5 years. It looks pretty good, I think, and the amazing thing is that since the original weed clearance in the first place, I haven't pulled a single weed out of that since in that time. You might say that this sort of thing is one of the disadvantages of organic gardening. The birds actually pull this out onto the lawn in search of worms, but quite frankly I love to see it because it doesn't take long just to clear it up, and it does at least mean that I'm attracting the wildlife into the garden. Now the commercial equivalent of that is this stuff. It's ornamental pine bark mulch, and you can buy this in the garden centre in various grades. You need to put it on about, 3 inches thick, I suppose, and so it's not a cheap project, but it does last a long time, it looks excellent, and it does a very good job of retaining moisture and of course keeping the weeds down too. But the very best, I think, is this stuff. Now you can see, if you look closely at the soil down here, you can see where my heavy soil is beginning to crack as it dries out. What you really need to do is to retain the moisture in that, and this is ideal for it. This is composted cow manure, and it's a little bit different from the other stuff in that, unlike those, this one contains nutrients as well. So what'll happen is that gradually the rain will wash the nutrients down to the root zone where it's needed, and also the weather and the worms will pull that organic matter down into the soil too, and that of course is just where it's needed. Here's a perfect example of nature's own pest control at work. This little clump of plants here is Limnanthes douglasii, the fried egg plant, and it's an absolutely ideal attractor of the hoverfly. It's because the flowers are very open and the pollen is easily accessible that they're attracted to it. Because hoverfly have only got a very short pollen tube, so you need an open flower. Once they've had their feed of pollen, then they'll lay their eggs, and when they lay them, of course they lay them in clumps of greenfly. Well, of course, you've got to have those clumps of greenfly on your plants before the hoverflies will lay their eggs. So if you're an organic gardener, for heaven's sake, don't get paranoid about having a few greenfly on your plants, because the hoverfly will lay the eggs, the larvae will hatch out, and of course they'll eat the greenfly. Perfect example of it here, look. This fuchsia was absolutely covered in greenfly, and you can see here some evidence of their damage, just little puckering of the leaves. I've done absolutely nothing with this plant at all, and I will guarantee that you now won't find a single greenfly on it at all, and that I put down to the work of Mr. Hoverfly. On the roses over here, there is a little bit of greenfly there, not very much at all. I'm certainly not going to do anything about that, because I'm quite sure the hoverflies will clear it up. In fact, in another part of the garden, I've got a very good example, because there are 2 shoots on a climbing rose right next to each other. One of them absolutely covered in greenfly. The one next to it, which was covered in greenfly a week ago, is now completely clear of them. I put that down again to hoverflies, and they're going to move on to that infested shoot and clear that up for me too. Okay, that's what I'd do. If you do get paranoid about it, I don't think you should, but if you do, then there are organic insecticides that you can spray on. This one is a potassium soap, and that will soon clear them up, and it's entirely organic. Marigolds are pretty good attractors of hoverflies and other insects too, and they're also said to control eelworm in the soil, though I must say I've never had a chance to test that one. But I've got a fairly common problem here on this cauliflower, a rather nice little clump there of cabbage white butterfly caterpillars. Now very shortly they're going to be getting pretty active, and they'll chew enormous holes in the leaves of this cauliflower. But quite honestly, I'm not really worried about it, because it won't be very long before this cauliflower is ready to harvest. So the caterpillars aren't going to really cause that much trouble. But you know, the one thing that you shouldn't do is to blindly follow the farmer or the commercial grower. Now, okay, if you had that problem on 25 acres of cauliflowers, perhaps you might have to spray it. But I've got half a dozen here, and the much better way of controlling them is just to go round and go like that. And hey presto, the job is done without any noxious chemicals at all. Now, if you feel a little bit squeamish about doing that, okay, perhaps you might want to spray. But Even then, you don't need to use a chemical pesticide because there is a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, which actually feeds on those caterpillars. You can buy it in the garden centre as a powder, put it in a sprayer, and just spray them off. Of course, the organic gardener should always be trying to take advantage of nature's own method of pest control by attracting as many predators into the garden to feed on insect pests. But there are some pests that seem quite immune. Earwigs, for example, though they're eaten by birds, still seem to escape quite a bit, mainly because they work at night. What they do is to get into the centre of blooms of flowers, particularly things like dahlias and chrysanthemums, and there they chew the base of petals, distorting them and really ruining the flower. Now, as I say, they work at night, and during the day they like to hide somewhere. So the way the organic gardener defeats them is this. He gives them a place to hide by putting a small pot on the top of the cane and filling it with a little bit of dry grass or straw. The earwigs will crawl into there, and every morning you come out, you shake the straw into a polythene bag and dispose of it, and then put another bit in and catch the next lot. This really is my favourite method of organic pest control. If you have a close look at some of these leaves, you can see lots of tiny little holes, and that is typical of damage by flea beetles. They attack seedlings in particular. Now, they're called flea beetles because when you approach the crop, they'll jump upwards, and you can use that fact to control them. As soon as you see the first signs of damage, then you take a little bit of board like this, coat it with grease, and just run it over the top of the crop like that. The flea beetles will jump upwards, stick to the grease, and you've got them controlled. Well, I suppose I must admit that that is just a little tongue-in-cheek, because quite frankly the beetles are so tiny you can really hardly see them on the board, so you don't really know whether you can control them or not. But the important phrase to note is as soon as you see the first sign of damage, because that really is an essential part of organic pest and disease control. Take regular looks at your crops, and as soon as you see any damage at all, that's the time to take action, and you'll probably nip the whole thing in the bud. Now, a much better way of controlling these and lots of other pests is to use this stuff. This is spun polypropylene fleece, and you can actually protect the crops physically just by placing it over the top. Now, you couldn't do this with polythene because polythene is a bit stiff, and first of all, in the wind it will sort of bash down on the top of the crops and damage them that way. And also, the crops get very overheated underneath there. Whereas this stuff is, first of all, very light, and also it's very porous too. So it'll let water through and air, so the crops don't really get too hot underneath. It's a very good control, for instance, for carrot fly as well. Carrot fly makes those nasty little brown tunnels in the roots, but if you cover up here, then the female fly can't get in there to lay her eggs. And there are also lots of cabbage white butterflies around at the moment, so I'm covering up the cabbages too with this stuff, so there's certainly not going to be any problems there. If it has a snag, I must say it does look a little bit obtrusive, but bear in mind that it doesn't have to be over the crops for long. I mean, these would have to be covered, I suppose, about middle of July. As soon as you see the first cabbage white butterflies, it can probably come off again round about September time, and you'll have cabbages without any holes in.
What's going on here then, Bill?
The work I'm doing in Cardiff is to do with biological control of slugs. Now, one of the main problems with chemical control is that you kill off your predators within the garden. But using a technique like this, very appropriate for your organic garden, yes. I thought, you can actually use the predators and concentrate them where you want them. I brought along some carabid beetles. These are the creatures that this is designed to work with. They're very common. They're ground beetles. Most people know them as ground beetles. There are many different species in everybody's garden, really. The idea is that what happens is that the beetles crawling around your garden will tend to fall off this edge into the bed.
I
Give
see,
them a
so it
little
acts
push.
like a sort of trap for them. It's very interesting because I always think of hedgehogs and birds killing the slugs off, not so much the beetles.
Yes, well these do. They do eat slugs. They'll eat about one small slug every day, in fact.
Yeah, so what have you used to construct the barrier?
Well, you have to get a very good edge, and Jeff's got very claggy, lumpy soil here,
Yeah.
which you can't get a fine tilth with. So the idea is to use something like this sharp sand, which has the dual effect of creating a good edge and keeping further slugs out.
Mm.
The inside here is just lawn edging, which is well into the ground. It's
Yeah.
the taller sort of lawn edging, which forms a good strong barrier, which the beetles can't then escape from. Over time, it'll accumulate more and more beetles and become more and more effective.
Yes. What happens though when the beetles have eaten up all the slugs that are in here? Do they die of starvation?
Well, no, fortunately, they can perform a lying in wait strategy for any other slugs that come along. They can subsist off worms or other insects, in fact, other pests that may be plaguing you. So, you know, you don't have to worry about that.
It's quite a long-lasting
Yes,
enterprise.
well, yes, the beetles will last, they will live a couple of years.
Mm.
But even so, I would advise when you've finished with the vulnerable crop, whether it's lettuce or whatever, that you allow the beetles out because you're going to need them next year and you'll want them to breed in appropriate habitats around the garden.
Right. What's the purpose of these slates on here?
Well, these are refuges for the beetles in the early stages. Later on, when the lettuces or whatever have grown up, they can hide in the plants themselves. But in the meantime, during the day, they have to hide from the bigger predators, the birds, and bits of slate, tiles, whatever, are ideal. There's a whole range of predators, in fact, that you get in the garden.
I had no idea there were so many different types.
Yes, for example, here's another species of carabid beetle. It's a bigger one than the one I showed you just now. And of course, being bigger, they can tackle bigger slugs, so they're even better. The bigger the beetle, the better it is actually at controlling slugs in your garden.
Certainly active, aren't they?
Certainly are, yes, yes. I don't think they like the light very much. Now, I've also got the larva of one of these carabid beetles. It's interesting because even at this stage they eat slugs, smaller slugs obviously, but they're voracious predators in fact. They've got great big nipping jaws on the front.
So if anybody finds any of those, they're not to squash them?
No, no, I don't think it's a leather jacket or something like that because it's got big jaws. It's quite easy to recognise in fact. And these beetles here are even more devilish looking, I think. In fact, they're called the devil's coach horse.
Oh, I don't like those. They give me the creeps.
No, they don't seem to like each other
They
either.
don't, do they?
But they're very good predators of slugs.
Yeah.
They're quite a familiar beetle, in fact. Turn over rotten logs or stones, you're likely to find these. Okay. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Right, now, here we've got the common centipede. Not many people realise that that's a slug predator.
I certainly didn't.
No, well, they're quite a common predator in the garden. Unlike the millipede, which actually is a plant eater, the centipede is quite a voracious predator
This
as
is
well.
terribly important for people to know because they could be treading on the wrong ones. How
Yes,
so
well,
the difference is quite obvious. I'm not
centipedes-
going to sit and count the legs.
That's right, centipedes, if you can count the legs, then it's a centipede. Millipedes have too many legs
Oh,
to
I
count, so
see, yes.
it's quite easy to tell the difference. The millipedes are usually black, not always. Now this is a very interesting thing. It's a predatory slug. Quite easy to recognise because it has a shell on the back. It's one of the testacella slugs. We have 3 species in this country and they hunt underground. They follow slugs and worms through the soil and in theory therefore one would think they would be good at hunting the burrowing slugs, the garden slugs and the keel slugs in particular.
I think it's beautiful. I've never seen a
It
slug
is.
like it.
No, they're rather nice little shell and they're not particularly slimy.
What's he like underneath?
But unfortunately, they are a bit thin on the ground. They have a very patchy distribution, probably commonest in the southern and western parts of the British Isles. And this next one is possibly even more special. It's a glowworm larva. Now both glowworms and their larvae eat slugs, which not many people realise. They eat snails too. They crawl into the snail's shell through the opening and gradually eat them out. They're rather gruesome.
I've never seen one. Why are they so scarce?
Well, they do say that it's because the males are attracted away from the small lights of the female by the brighter lights of cars, and as a result they get bashed.
What a shame.
So you tend to find them only in the remoter areas. Still, they're rather nice things. Bit creepy. But anyway, I'll put him back. And now we hope to show how these beetles will tackle a slug. So
I don't think I want to see this.
It's a bit gruesome, I'm afraid, but I hope they want their lunch. We'll soon see. There you are.
Oh my goodness, that's
They're
horrible.
tucking in beautifully.
Oh.
You see.
Bill reckons that this and digging and hoeing are just about the best methods of getting rid of slugs, because it bashes them about a bit and turns up them and their eggs so that the birds can eat them. But if you're a little bit worried about this and beetles tearing slugs to pieces, well then I'm afraid that really is nature in the raw, and that's the sort of thing that you're trying to encourage. But believe me, you kill a lot less than you do with chemical warfare. Of course, the very best way of coping with pests and diseases is to avoid them altogether. Well, that sounds too good to be true, I know, but it is actually possible to take advantage of the resistance of some plants to many pests and diseases. Sometimes that resistance is natural, very often it's deliberately bred in, and here is a very good example. Let's have a look at this apple. This variety is covered with apple scab. You see those brown marks there? And yet growing right next to it is another variety, and that is clean as a whistle. Certain of the brassicas, the cabbage family, are much more attracted to slugs than others. So if you've got slug problems, it might be wise, for instance, to grow spring cabbage and kale, which are much less susceptible to slugs than, say, cauliflowers or Brussels sprouts. Many plants, like potatoes, strawberries, and lots of others, are subject to virus diseases, and of course there's no cure for those, so it's essential to start with clean stock. Fortunately, the Ministry of Agriculture run a certification scheme which guarantees that the stock is free from virus disease. So if you're buying one of the plants that's on the list, then make sure it's certified. There's no such thing in the organic gardener's language as a chemical weed killer. They're expensive, difficult to use, and really quite hazardous. And the only thing you need, frankly, whether you're an organic gardener or not, is a hoe. Something like this. This, in fact, is a fairly large job. This is a wheel hoe, and it's got a wheel on the front here which makes pushing very easy, and the cutters on the back which just slice through weeds as you push it along. Now this one obviously is for the gardener who's got a fairly large area. If you've got a large garden or an allotment, I quite honestly wouldn't be without it, because it does the job very, very quickly indeed. All you've got to do with this is simply just to choose a sunny day if you can, and just push it along the top. You cut the weeds off and they'll lie on the top and wilt. But if you've got a smaller space, or you need more accurate weeding around plants, then this is a good tool. This is the Dutch hoe. You can buy these in any garden centre, and it's a good idea to keep it sharp. Just put a file on it from time to time, because that'll save you quite a bit of effort. The difference between this and the wheel hoe is that instead of working forwards, you work backwards. Just walk backwards with this one, because that saves you actually treading on the weeds that you've pulled out. And if you do that, even if the day is not quite as sunny as it is today, you avoid walking on them and transplanting them, and they'll lie there on the top and still wilt. A scorched earth policy. That's another way of organically controlling weeds. As you can imagine, small weeds wither immediately under one of these things, and bigger ones don't take long either. They're not expensive to buy and really quite cheap to hire too. And a flame gun like this works on paraffin under pressure, really just like an enormous blow lamp. Once you get the knack of them, they're quite safe to use. But quite frankly, I still prefer my hoe. But like many things in organic gardening, prevention is far better than cure. You can buy from the garden centre black polythene mulching sheet, and if you lay this between rows of vegetables, you'll effectively smother out all the weeds. You can use much the same technique with this brown paper material. The principle, of course, is that if you exclude light from any green plant for long enough, then eventually it's going to die. And you can use this in the vegetable garden and actually plant through it. What you do is you prepare a bed of the right size, digging it and fertilising it as normal. Then you lay your paper out and just cover it up, hold it down with soil at the edges here. And then you can just cut slits in it at the appropriate places. You can see it's conveniently marked out to give you a good guideline. Cut a cross slit in like that, and then you can plant through, either using your fingers if your soil's like mine, or if it's a little bit stony or got bits of glass in it, then use a trowel. Make sure that you press the soil firmly around the roots like that, and you'll find that you get no weeds growing up, of course. And the other great advantage, particularly with things like lettuce, is that you can, because there's no contact with the soil, you go a long way to avoiding fungus diseases as well, which often attack lettuce at the base of the plant. And when you finish there, make sure that you water in well. That actually is quite necessary. But this paper is porous, so after you've done this initial job, then you don't need to take any special precautions over watering. Chemical gardens will tell you that organic lawn care is not very successful. Well, in one way they're right. Certainly you won't get that rapid green up that you will from a chemical fertiliser. The reason is that the chemical fertiliser contains very high nitrogen levels. But what that does is to make the lawn soft and sappy, and the grass then is much more prone to attack from diseases. Much better, in my view, is to feed either with a liquid animal manure fertiliser or with seaweed. You won't get such a rapid green up, but what you will get is a balanced feed that will make the grass nice and strong and green right the way through the season. Of course, there aren't any weed killers in that. There's no such thing as an organic weed and feed, because there's no such thing as an organic weed killer. But this is one thing you can do. First of all, go round and see where you can find weeds. Just get a little bit of ordinary table salt and just drop a little pinch onto the crown of the plant. Now be very careful that you don't actually get this on the grass, because it would dehydrate any plant, and so that would kill your grass as well. But that'll kill those weeds out. Let me get rid of that. Or the alternative, of course, is to just go around every now and then, and as soon as you see a weed, just whip it out with your knife like that. And that, after a while, will work. You know, the very best weed killer, without a doubt, is to keep your grass growing really strongly. That will compete with the weeds and, frankly, keep them out. Now, if the grass is suffering because the lawn is badly drained, then it's a good idea to go over it with a fork every now and then the spring or the autumn, good times to do this. Get fairly deep down and fairly close together to make some good holes. And once you've done that, just brush into there some fairly coarse, sharp sand. Now, if, on the other hand, your grass is suffering because the ground is too well drained, and very often they do, then what you want in there is organic matter. And the ideal thing to use is a bit of fine composted cow muck. Just spread it over the top like that. Give it a good old rake in. It looks pretty grim for a very short while, but the grass will soon grow to cover that, and the manure will get down to the rooting level where it's really going to do a bit of good. If your lawn is a bit lumpy and in bad condition, then it's a good idea to give it a top dressing, and I would do this in the autumn. I make up my own top dressing with a bit of fine sieved garden soil, a bit of coarse grit, and again some of this composted cow manure. And that makes a really nice top dressing. You can just spread that over the lawn. And once again, go over it with a rake, and this will fill up all your little holes. Your grass will soon grow through this. It'll fill up all those little holes and give it a good feed at the same time. A small greenhouse is absolutely invaluable for the organic gardener. You can raise all sorts of plants for planting outside later on, and you can grow on the tender plants inside. Of course, seedlings can be raised on the windowsill too. But if you're growing in any pots or trays, any sort of container, then you must use a proper compost. Garden soil is just not good enough. And of course, if it's going to be a compost for us, then it's got to be organic. Now, I favour this one. This is my speciality. It's made with a worm-worked compost that I've been making myself, and I mix that one with 2 parts of sphagnum peat to 1 part of worm-worked compost, and that's absolutely packed with nutrients there, and that's ideal for sowing. Anything after that, pricking out or potting on, then I use a 50-50 mix. Now, of course, not everybody does that, but if you don't, you can buy a proprietary compost from the garden centre. This one is a particularly good one. This is made with cow muck, which has been well composted and mixed with sphagnum peat. That's a good compost. That you can use this one for sowing or for potting. It's a general purpose one. Now, because it's organic, by the very nature of being organic, then these things do tend to be a little bit variable. And sometimes you'll find that these come a little bit wet. If they come so wet that you can squeeze them into a ball and they don't readily break apart again, then it's too wet for sowing. So just put that out onto a board or something and leave it there for about an hour to dry, and then it'll be perfectly okay for using. You don't, when you're sowing, want to compress these composts too much, so just a couple of fingers down the sides like this, and one in the middle, and then a little bit more on the top. Just strike it off with a board, like that, and then just press it level with the board. That is all you need. Now, it's most important to water the compost before you start to sow. So we'll water that in so that it's really wet. It needs to be really well soaked. It looks a very messy job, doesn't it? But absolutely vital, that. And then you can sow. I'm going to sow some lettuce in here. And the essence with sowing anything is to sow thinly. So I put it out in my hand, and then I just tap it out like that. You can see there's a little channel there, which enables you to sow nice and thinly. It's amazing. That, I mean, I certainly will never want any more lettuce than that. It's surprising how many seeds there are there, and most of those are going to come through too. They want covering very lightly, so I use a sieve for that. Just a little covering. Don't go mad with this. You only want a tiny little covering over them. That's all. And then no pressing or anything after that. That box should then be covered with a bit of opaque polythene and put in a warmish spot, hopefully a little bit of heat underneath it. And those will soon come through. Now, when they do come through, they're going to be a bit close together, so they want pricking out. Strange word, that's what we call it. I have sowed before these petunias, and they're, as you can see, very crowded here, so they need pricking out. And what you do is you take a little bit of stick and just lift them out like that, very carefully. Always notice, always handling by the leaves, never by the stem, because you'll bruise them. And then just put them in about, I suppose, inch and a half, about 3 centimetres, 3 or 4 centimetres apart, something like that. And there they'll grow on to a planting out stage. I'll finish that one off later on. Now, after about, between 4 to 6 weeks, I suppose, of any potting, then you're going to need to start feeding, because the feed in the compost will have run out. And again, it needs to be organic. And one good alternative is to use a seaweed feed. You can buy it in liquid form, and all you've got to do is put one cap like that in 2.5 gallons, and there you are, you can feed. But the one that I favour is a homemade job, actually, and that's made by filling a sack or a net full of farmyard manure. Sheep manure is absolutely ideal, and you just suspend that in a tank of water, and you can use that stuff neat. That doesn't look bad, does it? You know, even hanging baskets and containers really ought to be grown organically, and my goodness, they do look good when they are grown that way. If you want to finish up with a real ball of colour like that right the way through the summer, then you should start out with a nice deep wire basket. You could buy the same sort of pattern in plastic, but those little plastic saucer-shaped ones don't really hold enough to make a decent basket. Then line the basket with a bit of sphagnum moss. Now, you can buy this stuff at the garden centre. It is possible to line the bottom of it with a little bit of plastic, but somehow it doesn't seem to go in a organic garden at all, does it? So a little bit of sphagnum moss there. I would use a little bit of plastic just in the very bottom, just a square like that, because that will help to retain the water. And of course, one of the big problems with hanging baskets is retaining the water during the summer. Right, now, I haven't completely filled that, but now I'm going to put some compost in. And the sort of compost you use, I think, is important. I'm using some soil in this because soil does act as a bit of a buffer and prevent it drying out. So I've mixed 50-50 good garden soil with proprietary organic compost, and that I find extremely successful. Right, just fill it up halfway there, because what you want to do is to poke some plants in through the sides, because that's going to give you this terrific looking ball of flower like that. Now, you want to put these, of course, right the way round. This one actually is trailing lobelia, blue lobelia, should look pretty good. When you've got them all round, well, first of all, of course, you need to top up with your sphagnum moss right up to the very top, because you want to get a little sort of a lip, really, to enable you to water properly. Right round like that, and then you can fill in with a little bit more compost. Not too much, because you've got quite a few plants to go in there yet. Now, you start off by putting, of course, a fairly large plant in the centre, and I think I'm going to use this rather nice fuchsia. That's going to take up quite a bit of room. Nice big plant there. Now, you can really cram plants into these hanging baskets. A few petunias in round there. Let's just put a couple in. My goodness, these petunias are bright, aren't they? They're really going to make that look good. You want a few trailing plants in as well. You could use something like trailing geraniums. They'll go in round there like that. And then, when you've done that, just top it up with a little bit more compost, because then you're going to finish off by putting a little bit more of the trailing lobelia in there to really hang down the sides. And when you've finished planting, naturally you'll need to give that a really good watering, but there'll be enough food in the organic compost for probably about a fortnight. The one important thing to bear in mind with hanging baskets is that you really do have to water these, certainly every single day, and after about a fortnight you're going to have to start feeding. You want a high potash fertiliser, so the absolutely ideal thing to use is an organic tomato fertiliser. Do that and you'll get that sort of result right the way through the summer. Well, that, I'm afraid, is the end of our bit of tape. Hopefully in the future we'll have some more for you. In the meantime, get out there in your garden, do the thing nature's way, and believe me, you're going to enjoy it. And what's more, the birds, the bees, the butterflies and all your gardening friends will enjoy it with you.